What reasonable suspicion do you have?
Don't argue. Cooperate.
I am cooperating. Here's my driver's license and my federal judge credentials. This stop has no legal basis.
I'm verifying it. Turn around.
If you come for U.S. judge over...
The black SUV sat under the glaring afternoon sun in the crowded parking lot of La Vista Mall. Judge Angela Morrison, 55, bent slightly as she loaded a paper bag of groceries into the trunk. The aroma of roasted coffee from the nearby cafe mingled with the faint scent of hot asphalt. A group of teenagers laughed from across the lot, their voices punctuating the ordinary chaos of Saturday shoppers. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," a firm voice called. Judge Morrison straightened slowly, turning to see Officer Jeff Caldwell approaching, hand hovering near his service weapon. His eyes narrowed, scanning the lot as if expecting to uncover a crime. "Officer, I am loading my own car with my purchases. What reasonable suspicion do you have?" Caldwell's jaw tightened. "I need to see some identification." The words were clipped-practiced, but the weight behind them suggested more than just protocol. It carried authority, intimidation. Around them, the hum of engines and distant chatter faded, as nearby shoppers noticed the confrontation, some stopping to observe, some already reaching for their phones. Morrison's hand stayed on her grocery bag, deliberate and unhurried. "These are my purchases. My vehicle is properly registered. There is no legal basis for this stop." The officer's gaze flickered toward the license plate, then back to her. For a moment, the sun glinted off the metal of his badge, a symbol of power that suddenly felt arbitrary. The tension escalated when Caldwell took a half-step closer, his stance rigid. "You need to cooperate." Around them, a small crowd had begun to form. A young woman near the next row of cars raised her phone, filming from 20 feet away. Whispers traveled through the lot, curiosity, confusion, and the slow-growing awareness that something was not right. Judge Morrison reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet, revealing her driver's license, federal judge identification, and courthouse security credentials. She placed them gently in Caldwell's view. "These are official. You are detaining me without reasonable suspicion. This is a Fourth Amendment violation." Caldwell's hand twitched slightly near his holster. He had responded to countless suspicious person calls, many of them routine, easily resolved with a nod and compliance. This woman, calm and deliberate, challenged every instinct honed over years on the force. "I need to verify this," he muttered, more to himself than to her, as he retreated a step, tension coiling in his shoulders. The crowd sensed the absurdity. The law itself was under scrutiny. Other shoppers began filming, capturing the exchange as the first seeds of social accountability planted themselves. Morrison's gaze swept over the witnesses, a subtle nod to the woman recording. In that moment, it was clear the confrontation was no longer just between two individuals. It was a microcosm of power, prejudice, and the precise definition of justice unfolding in real time before dozens of witnesses. Judge Angela Morrison did not appear suddenly in the mall that Saturday. Her journey to the federal bench had been shaped by decades of diligent sacrifice and an unwavering commitment to justice. Born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1968, she grew up in a neighborhood where the sirens of police cars were as familiar as the church bells on Sunday. Her parents, both educators, instilled in her a belief that the law was a tool to protect the vulnerable, not intimidate them. After earning her law degree at 24, Morrison joined a small civil rights firm in the city. She worked long nights on cases that often seemed unwinnable, challenging housing discrimination, police misconduct, and voting rights violations. In those early years, she witnessed families torn apart by wrongful arrests, students denied access to education, and neighbors silenced by fear of reprisal. Every small victory reinforced her resolve. Every setback sharpened her determination. She became known for meticulous preparation, a calm presence in the courtroom, and an insistence on fairness even when it was unpopular. By 1998, she had argued before state appellate courts, gaining a reputation for clarity and precision in her legal reasoning. 10 years later, she was appointed to the federal bench, a moment of pride not only for her, but for her community. As a U.S. Circuit Court judge, she presided over cases that would define civil liberties across multiple states. Her opinions, often cited for their rigor and depth, shaped law enforcement accountability, qualified immunity debates, and civil rights jurisprudence. She had seen firsthand the consequences when those in power acted without restraint. Officer Jeff Caldwell, in contrast, had spent his life on a very different trajectory. Born and raised in a suburban enclave of the same city he had joined the police force straight out of high school, eager to serve and protect. His first decade was marked by routine patrols, community outreach programs, and commendations for punctuality and procedural compliance. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. Caldwell developed a pattern of aggressive responses to minority citizens in his patrol zone. Complaints were lodged against him, sometimes formal, sometimes whispered, but internal reviews often concluded without action. He learned quickly that maintaining authority sometimes required asserting it publicly, even if it meant bending perception rather than facts. Caldwell's past encounters created a psychological foundation that shaped the events of that afternoon. Years of minor confrontations, overlooked infractions, and institutional tolerance for bias had trained him to respond defensively to anyone who challenged his authority. When Morrison presented her credentials calmly yet assertively, it was not just a routine stop. It was a confrontation with someone whose very presence exposed the gaps in his judgment. In his mind, hesitation equaled weakness, and any doubt had to be suppressed by a display of control. Meanwhile, Morrison's background made her uniquely equipped to navigate this type of encounter. Years of examining evidence, questioning witnesses, and understanding procedural nuances allowed her to anticipate missteps and respond strategically. She recognized the legal parameters of reasonable suspicion, understood her Fourth Amendment rights, and maintained composure under stress even as the officer's tone hardened. Every move she made was deliberate, a blend of self-preservation and legal foresight honed over decades of public service. This collision of life paths, the disciplined, experience-driven prudence of Morrison and the conditioned authority-asserting reflexes of Caldwell, set the stage for the escalation at La Vista Mall. Neither was acting in isolation. Morrison brought the weight of her career and a lifetime of advocacy for justice, while Caldwell carried the reinforced patterns of unchecked discretion. Their histories would inform every word, every gesture, and every choice in the unfolding confrontation. In those years leading up to the encounter, Morrison had also trained younger judges and clerks in recognizing implicit bias, the importance of evidence over assumptions, and the dangers of allowing authority to override reason. She had written extensively on systemic inequities in policing, drawing on both her legal rulings and the stories of ordinary citizens who had suffered injustice. Caldwell, conversely, had internalized a law enforcement culture that often prioritized compliance and control over critical evaluation, a culture that would momentarily blind him to the clear, lawful reality standing before him. The convergence at the parking lot then was not merely an isolated incident. It was the inevitable meeting of two meticulously formed histories. One defined by integrity, foresight, and commitment to equity, and the other by habituated authority, fear of weakness, and latent biases that had never been corrected. Every glance, every question, and every pause was informed by these backstories, setting the stage for the escalating tension that would draw the attention of witnesses and recorders, and eventually the scrutiny of the nation. Judge Angela Morrison held up her credentials once more, the laminated card catching the sunlight. Officer Jeff Caldwell's eyes flicked to the letters embossed on the ID United States Circuit Court Judge. For most, that would have ended the confrontation. For Caldwell, the crowd gathering and his own fear of appearing weak, it only escalated the tension. "I need to verify this," Caldwell muttered, retreating a step, but keeping his voice firm. Morrison's gaze remained steady. She could feel the energy shifting in the lot. Shoppers were slowing down, pulling phones from pockets, whispering some filming. One man adjusted his camera on a tripod, capturing a clear line of sight. The atmosphere thickened, a combination of curiosity, disbelief, and latent frustration at the power imbalance unfolding before them. "Officer, I've shown you my credentials. This is my vehicle, and I am not suspected of any crime. What legal authority are you invoking?" Morrison asked, her voice calm but precise. Caldwell's jaw clenched. He scanned her quickly, noticing the firmness in her posture, the deliberate calm in her gestures, and the slight nod she gave to the woman recording from 20 feet away. Every detail seemed to confirm his insecurities. The small crowd grew. A mother with her children froze mid-step, watching. A teenager whispered to his friend, "Why is she being treated like this?" The murmurs spread a ripple of collective awareness. Caldwell's mind raced. If he released her now, it would appear as though he had been duped, his authority undermined in front of witnesses. His hands hovered near his belt, a subtle tension betraying the internal conflict between protocol and ego. Morrison, recognizing the precarious position, chose precision over protest. She raised her hand slightly, a gesture of compliance paired with assertion. "I am not resisting. I am asserting my constitutional rights." The words, carefully measured, acted as both shield and sword, signaling her understanding of the law and her refusal to be intimidated. Other shoppers began filming, phones raised like silent witnesses. The clicks of cameras punctuated the tense dialogue, capturing every moment for posterity. A man from a nearby cafe leaned out a window, holding his phone over the railing. The auditory chaos, the distant rev of engines, the chatter of patrons, the soft hum of a mall fountain seemed to fade, leaving the confrontation in stark relief. Caldwell's hand twitched near the holster again. He had responded to dozens of calls like this before, each time in scenarios that seemed suspicious at first glance. Most suspects complied without question. Most did not challenge his authority, certainly not with the calm, deliberate confidence that Morrison displayed. She was forcing him to confront not just her legality, but the assumptions that had guided his career. The crowd's attention intensified. Whispers turned into comments. Questions shouted under breaths. Is she under arrest? What did she do? The atmosphere was no longer just a mall lot. It had become a stage for a larger conversation about authority, race, and justice. Morrison's calm persistence contrasted sharply with Caldwell's visible discomfort. Every gesture, every pause, every line of dialogue was now being documented by multiple angles, creating a permanent record of bias meeting reason. As Caldwell finally stepped back to radio for verification, Morrison held her stance, eyes surveying the gathering crowd, acknowledging the recordings without breaking composure. It was a strategic pause. The escalation was no longer solely between officer and judge. It had become a matter of public witness accountability and exposure. She understood the psychological dynamic power misapplied could be contained only by law and observation, and she had both. The tension remained electric. Caldwell's body language betrayed his indecision. His voice, though firm, had lost some of its initial authority. The crowd sensed it. Some shuffled closer. Some whispered advice. Others simply watched, aware that the unfolding scene was a rare window into the exercise of authority unchecked. Morrison's patience, her legal knowledge, and her composure were now the only stabilizing force in an otherwise volatile scenario, and every observer understood it. Officer Jeff Caldwell's hand moved to the cuffs with a tense deliberation. Judge Angela Morrison turned slowly, placing her hands behind her back. The metal clicked around her wrists, a sharp sound that seemed to echo across the parking lot. The crowd stirred, phones raised, whispers growing louder. The sound of the car engines and distant chatter became a background hum, as if the world had narrowed to this single absurd moment. Morrison's breathing was steady. She did not resist. She did not panic. Her eyes scanned the lot, noting witnesses' recordings and the small group that had gathered nearby. Every movement was deliberate. She understood the significance, the legality of the officer's actions, the rights she was asserting, and the witnesses who could bear testimony. The slow, meticulous precision of her gestures contrasted sharply with Caldwell's taut movements, each step betraying his growing discomfort. "Step into the patrol car," Caldwell commanded, his voice tight, almost trembling. Morrison obeyed, sliding into the back seat. The plastic bench pressed against her legs, the faint chemical smell of cleaning solution mingled with the leather of the seat. She could feel the weight of every gaze, every camera recording the moment. The officer closed the door behind her with a dull thud, sealing the immediate space in a tight, tense compartment. The drive to the precinct was silent, save for the occasional crackle from the police radio. Caldwell's hands gripped the wheel rigidly, knuckles white. Morrison's mind, however, was active, mapping the steps she would take next, documenting every detail, anticipating legal strategies, preserving evidence. The quiet interior of the car was charged to containment of authority and rights in stark opposition. Each traffic light, each turn, stretched the tension. The slow pace allowed Morrison to observe Caldwell's posture, his eyes darting to mirrors and windows as if seeking reassurance that the world had not yet recognized the gravity of his actions. She imagined how the dash camera would record each moment, the potential witnesses' footage, and how each piece of evidence could later reveal the bias and error behind this encounter. At the station, Morrison was escorted to the processing area by Caldwell. Officer Carmen Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran, met them with a professional detachment. Morrison handed over her personal belongings for cataloging keys, phone wallet, and identification. Rodriguez's eyes briefly scanned the federal judge credentials, the holographic seals catching the fluorescent lights. The credibility was undeniable. Caldwell's tension increased as the implications of his decision began to crystallize. Every procedural step that should have been routine now highlighted the absurdity and injustice of the situation. The paperwork, the cataloging, the radio checks, all became a slow-motion exposition of how authority misapplied can confine even those who understand the law intimately. In the holding area, Morrison remained composed, seated upright hands, uncrossed eyes forward. Her demeanor contrasted with Caldwell's growing unease, a psychological juxtaposition of law and power, right and assumption. The lingering silence was almost audible, a prelude to the revelation that would follow. The system itself, when confronted with the truth, could recognize the mistake, but only after authority had been asserted to an extreme degree. The entire sequence, from the click of the cuffs to the slow procession through the parking lot into the patrol car, and finally into the station, was a deliberate orchestration, by circumstances, history, and bias. It was a tableau of injustice meticulously documented in every gesture, every pause, and every observer's recording. Each moment underscored the fragile balance between power and accountability, the human cost of assumptions, and the importance of legal literacy and composure when confronted with authority exercised without restraint. Inside the police station, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the tiled floor. Judge Angela Morrison remained seated in the holding chair, her posture straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Officer Jeff Caldwell stood nearby, shifting uneasily, aware that every movement, every decision was now under scrutiny from both colleagues and the recordings capturing the encounter. Lieutenant Sarah Freeman, a seasoned officer with 25 years on the force, entered the room. Her eyes immediately assessed the situation. The judge in cuffs, the officer tense, and the room filled with subtle mounting awareness. "Who do we have here?" she asked, her voice controlled but carrying authority. Caldwell swallowed, handing over Morrison's credentials. Freeman examined the laminated identification, noting the holographic seal, the embossed letters, and the unmistakable emblem of the U.S. Circuit Court. Morrison's voice remained steady as she explained, "I am Judge Angela Morrison, United States Circuit Court. I have been on the federal bench for 18 years. The words hung in the air, precise and declarative, a legal and factual anchor in the unfolding chaos. Freeman's eyes widened slightly, the weight of recognition dawning. She picked up the phone and called the courthouse for verification. The call lasted less than 3 minutes, the response confirming every detail Morrison had presented. Caldwell's hands tightened at his sides, the color drained from his face. The realization was immediate and absolute. He had detained a federal judge without reasonable suspicion, violated her Fourth Amendment rights, and escalated a situation that should have ended peacefully within seconds. Every assumption he had acted upon, the suspicious vehicle, the out-of-place individual, the perceived need to assert authority, collapsed under the undeniable proof of her identity. The crowd that had gathered outside earlier now mirrored the revelation inside the station. Freeman relayed the confirmation to Caldwell. "You will release her immediately. You need to document everything and inform your supervisor." Morrison's handcuffs were removed, the metal clicking softly as they opened. She stood adjusting her jacket, her expression calm, composed, and utterly resolute. Caldwell remained motionless for a moment, his mind racing through the implications. Departmental protocol, potential civil suits, internal investigations, and public scrutiny. Every training scenario he had encountered now seemed painfully inadequate in the face of real-world consequences. Freeman's gaze held his, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of his misjudgment. Morrison retrieved her belongings methodically, checking the condition of each item. She glanced briefly at the witness's recording from the parking lot, her subtle nod, an acknowledgement of the importance of transparency and documentation. This was not merely a personal vindication. It was a teaching moment, an exposure of systemic bias and misapplied authority that could no longer be ignored. Freeman guided Caldwell to his desk to complete the incident report while Morrison prepared herself to exit the station. The slow motion of the prior events, the cuffs, the patrol car ride, the tension-filled silence contrasted sharply with the swiftness of the revelation. The power dynamic had shifted irreversibly, highlighting not only the officer's errors, but the resilience and preparedness of someone trained to understand the law and protect civil rights. As Morrison left the station, the gravity of what had occurred settled over the room. The plot twist, the undeniable verification of her identity, transformed a tense confrontation into a documented case of unlawful detention. Caldwell, for the first time, confronted the full consequences of bias assumption and the misapplication of authority. Every officer present understood that the revelation was not just procedural, it was moral, legal, and social. The scene closed on Morrison. Stepping into the afternoon light, her presence, a quiet assertion of justice. The recordings, the witness accounts, and the verified credentials together ensured that the truth was beyond dispute. In that moment, the revelation was complete. The law was clear, the rights of the individual undeniable, and the failure of judgment unmistakable. The moment Judge Angela Morrison stepped out of the police station, her mind shifted from survival to strategy. She had been detained for nearly 2 hours for performing an ordinary task, loading groceries into her own vehicle. Now every decision mattered. She began meticulously documenting the encounter, timestamps, witness statements, video recordings, and her own observations. This was not merely about vindication. It was about accountability, the kind that could prevent the same injustice from happening to others. Within hours, her legal team began drafting a federal complaint against Officer Jeff Caldwell and the city. The charges were precise: unlawful detention, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. Each claim was substantiated with evidence: the mall's security footage, body camera recordings, and bystander videos. Morrison knew that the power of documentation could not be overstated. The clarity of the facts would drive the narrative, leaving little room for denial. The city, initially slow to respond, soon faced the inevitable. News outlets picked up the story, and the video clips from the parking lot went viral, accumulating millions of views within a day. Social media was ablaze with outrage comments questioning systemic bias and calls for accountability. Civil rights organizations took notice, offering support and amplifying the narrative. The crowd that had once been passive witnesses became a catalyst for public pressure. Internal investigations began promptly. Senior members of the police department reviewed the incident with scrutiny. Caldwell's past records, previously overlooked, now came under close examination. Patterns emerged: repeated stops of minority drivers, documented complaints of bias, and procedural violations. The investigation revealed a culture where unchecked authority had allowed misconduct to persist. Each revelation added weight to Morrison's case, establishing systemic issues beyond the single incident. The legal process was deliberate and thorough. Depositions captured every detail, the sequence of events meticulously reconstructed. Caldwell's defense unraveled under the pressure of incontrovertible evidence. Witness testimony corroborated Morrison's account: the officer's demeanor, the unwarranted escalation, and the improper detainment. Each layer of proof reinforced the narrative of injustice, creating a clear path toward accountability. Ultimately, Caldwell faced severe consequences. He was terminated from the force, stripped of pension benefits, and barred from future law enforcement employment. The city council faced intense public scrutiny, leading to policy reforms, mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, stricter oversight of stops and detentions, and the establishment of a civilian review board with investigative authority. The ripple effects extended beyond one officer, touching the entire department and setting a precedent for future accountability. The lawsuit concluded with a substantial financial settlement. Morrison, consistent with her principles, donated the entirety of the award to civil rights organizations focused on police reform and legal education. Her objective was clear: the system needed to change, and the resources should empower those who lacked her position, knowledge, and access. The settlement became both a personal vindication and a broader instrument for social justice. In the aftermath, the incident became a case study in law schools, civil rights seminars, and community workshops. Students analyzed the legal nuances: Fourth Amendment protections, the limits of police authority, and the application of constitutional safeguards in everyday encounters. Community members discussed the psychological aspects: bias recognition, power dynamics, and strategies for de-escalation. Morrison's experience transformed into a teaching tool, extending the impact far beyond the immediate parties involved. By the end of the process, justice had been served on multiple levels. Caldwell faced professional and social consequences. The city implemented reforms to prevent recurrence. Morrison's meticulous documentation, legal acumen, and strategic patience ensured accountability. The broader lesson was clear: even entrenched systems could be challenged when evidence, law, and moral clarity intersected. The crusade for justice was not a single act. It was a sustained effort, transforming a moment of personal violation into systemic awareness and meaningful change. The detention of Judge Angela Morrison was more than an isolated incident. It became a case study in constitutional law and social awareness. From a legal perspective, the officer's actions violated the Fourth Amendment, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. There was no probable cause, no evidence of criminal activity, and no justification for the escalation. The event highlighted the importance of understanding one's legal rights and the mechanisms available to contest unlawful detention. Beyond the legalities, the situation exposed the psychological and social dynamics at play. Implicit bias, the subconscious assumptions that influence behavior, had guided Officer Caldwell's decisions. He perceived Morrison's presence near the vehicle as suspicious based on assumptions tied to race and appearance rather than facts. The incident illustrated how bias can escalate into real-world consequences, affecting both the targets of such assumptions and the officers enforcing them. Awareness and training are essential to mitigate these biases before they manifest in harmful actions. For the public, the case demonstrated practical steps to protect oneself in similar circumstances. First, remain calm and composed as Morrison did, maintaining visible hands and measured movements. Second, document the encounter whenever possible, recording video, noting times, and identifying witnesses. Third, assert your rights clearly and politely, referencing constitutional protections when appropriate. Fourth, after the encounter, contact legal counsel promptly to ensure proper action is taken. Each of these steps can preserve evidence and support accountability, turning a moment of vulnerability into a structured path toward justice. The broader lesson extends to community and institutional reform. Accountability does not rely solely on individual actions. It requires systemic oversight, transparency, and education. Civilian review boards, mandatory training on bias, and procedural law and public awareness campaigns are mechanisms to ensure that authority is exercised responsibly. Morrison's case became a teaching tool illustrating how legal knowledge, preparation, and composure can empower individuals and drive systemic change. Finally, the incident served as a reminder of the human element in law enforcement and society at large. Decisions are not made in a vacuum. They are influenced by history, training, assumptions, and social pressures. By observing, documenting, and learning from these events, communities can foster environments where rights are respected, mistakes are corrected, and justice is more consistently applied. Morrison's calm assertion of her rights, combined with the public documentation of Caldwell's misjudgment, created a ripple effect, reforms accountability, and a renewed understanding of the balance between authority and civil liberty. The call to action is clear. Individuals must know their rights. Officers must recognize and mitigate bias, and institutions must enforce accountability. Only through this triad can the patterns of misjudgment, discrimination, and unlawful authority be reduced. Judge Morrison's experience, documented in detail, continues to educate, inspire, and challenge both legal professionals and the public to engage actively in the protection of civil rights and the promotion of justice.